Imagine fighting a war, not just against an enemy army, but against the coldest, harshest environment on Earth. No sunlight for months, temperatures so low your breath could freeze mid-air, and oh, just to make it worse, your enemy knows the terrain better than you ever will. This is Britain's Arctic War, a battle so brutal, so bizarre, and so little known that most people don't even believe it happened. But it did, and it changed everything. You've heard of World War I, you've heard of World War II, but you've probably never heard of the Arctic War. And if you think this is just another history lesson, oh, you're in for a surprise. This is the frozen battle you've never heard of, and trust me, it's a story you'll never forget. The year was 1941. World War II was raging across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. But up in the Arctic Circle, a different battle was brewing. Why the Arctic? What could possibly be so important in a place where even polar bears don't want to live? The answer? Supply routes. Britain needed supplies, food, weapons, fuel, all from the US. But to get them, ships had to sail through the Arctic Ocean, right past Nazi-occupied Norway. And who was waiting there? The German Navy, armed with battleships, submarines, and bombers, ready to sink anything that floated. Enter the Arctic Convoys, massive groups of Allied supply ships escorted by the British Navy. Their mission? Sail through the Arctic Ocean, dodge German attacks, and somehow make it to Russia without freezing to death. Of the 78 convoys sent, 85 merchant ships were sunk. The sailors called it the suicide run. If you fell into the Arctic water, you had about 2 minutes before hypothermia set in. Even if you were rescued, frostbite could mean losing fingers, toes, or entire limbs. Oh, and did I mention this was all happening in total darkness? Yeah, no sunlight for months. Just a cold, black ocean and enemies lurking under the ice. Welcome to the Arctic War. All right, time to meet the people who were crazy enough to fight in this frozen wasteland. First up, Sir Dudley Pound, Admiral of the British Navy. He knew the convoys were dangerous, but Britain needed them to survive. And on the other side, Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the German Navy. This guy was the definition of calculated coldness. Raeder's mission? Sink every Allied ship that dared to cross the Arctic. Now, normally this would be a battle of ships and guns. But in the Arctic, the environment was just as much an enemy as the Germans. This wasn't just man versus man, it was man versus nature. Winston Churchill called the Arctic convoys the worst journey in the world. Sailors faced 60-foot waves, freezing temperatures, and constant enemy attacks. German submarines hid behind icebergs to ambush Allied ships. They'd wait in the shadows and then launch torpedoes at point-blank range. Yeah, hiding behind icebergs. Just when you thought war couldn't get any crazier. So, what was it like fighting in the Arctic? Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ships were covered in ice, making them top-heavy and prone to capsizing. Frostbite was a constant threat, and if you got wet, you were as good as dead. But the cold wasn't the only problem. The Arctic Ocean was full of ice floes, giant sheets of ice that could crush ships like tin cans. Oh, and did I mention the Germans were dropping bombs from planes that flew so high you couldn't even see them? Ice would build up on ships, making them top-heavy. If not removed, the ship could flip over, dumping the entire crew into the freezing water. The Germans set up secret weather stations in the Arctic to predict storms and ambush convoys. Some weren't discovered until the 1950s. In 1942, the Arctic War hit its peak. The Germans launched Operation Rösselsprung, an all-out attack on Allied convoys. Their target? Convoy PQ-17. The British received reports that the Tirpitz, the most powerful battleship in the world, was on its way. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound ordered the convoy to scatter and proceed independently. It was a massacre. Out of 35 merchant ships, 24 were sunk, and the Tirpitz never even showed up. By 1944, the Allies had secured the Arctic supply lines, but at a tremendous cost. Over 3,000 Allied sailors died in the Arctic convoys. This was Britain's Arctic War, a battle fought against impossible odds, in a place where even nature itself was the enemy. It was brutal, it was tragic, and it was almost forgotten. But now, you know the story of the frozen battle you've never heard of, until today. If you found this story as mind-blowing as I did, hit that like button. And if you want more forgotten battles and unbelievable history, subscribe to Infinitia Verity and join us on this wild ride through the past. Oh, and let me know in the comments, would you have survived the Arctic War? I'd love to hear your theories.